You can see how this happens. The light is starting to go soft at the end of the day. The plants look tired, the top of the bed looks pale, and you stand there with a hose in your hand doing what seems like the responsible thing. You soak the ground, you take your time. Maybe you even water more than usual because you were tired of seeing the leaves droop by noon. For a moment, everything looks corrected. The soil darkens. The bed smells alive again. The plants lift slightly, as if they were only waiting for this one act of mercy. Then the next day comes. By late morning, or maybe the middle of the afternoon, you walk back out and the surface already looks dry again. Sometimes it is not just dry, it looks exhausted, crusted, tight. The kind of dry that does not look like earth at all, but like something spent. You touch it with your fingers and the top breaks apart into dust, even though you know you watered. You remember standing there. You remember the weight of the hose, the sound of water hitting the ground, the dark color spreading across the bed. And yet, here it is again, as if the earth has swallowed everything and given nothing back. That is the moment a lot of people quietly turn on themselves. They do not always say it out loud, but they start thinking in a certain way. Maybe I am not consistent enough. Maybe I should water twice a day. Maybe I waited too long. Maybe I do not know what I am doing. Maybe some people just have a feel for this, and I do not. They buy better potting mix. They buy moisture crystals. They buy new nozzles, new timers, new bags of compost, new bottles with clean labels and promises on the front. And still the ground seems to behave the same way. Wet for a moment, dry again almost immediately. What makes this so frustrating is that it feels like such a basic problem. Water goes in. Plants should use it. Soil should hold some of it. That seems simple enough. So when that does not happen, it is easy to assume the mistake must be yours. You must be underdoing it, forgetting, misjudging, being careless in some small way that more experienced growers would never be careless about. But that is not usually what is happening. In fact, one of the strangest and most important things to understand about dry soil is that the people struggling with it are often the ones trying hardest. They are out there more. They are watching more closely. They are reacting faster. They see dryness and answer it immediately. They do what nearly everyone has been taught to do when soil looks thirsty. They add water, then they add more. Then they try to make up for yesterday by giving extra today. It feels sensible, responsible even. And yet sometimes that entire cycle becomes a trap. Because the question is not only whether water touched the soil. The question is what kind of ground received it. There is a big difference between water passing through a place and water becoming part of it. There is a difference between a surface getting wet and a living soil actually holding moisture in a useful way. And once you start seeing that difference, a lot of confusing experiences begin to make sense. Why one bed stays cool longer than another? Why one patch still feels damp under the surface while the exposed one nearby turns hard by noon? Why a plant growing in rich, covered ground can go longer between waterings than a plant in bare, open soil that gets watered all the time? Most people are taught to think of soil like a container, a neutral holding space. You pour water in, and if it is dry, you pour more. But soil is not a bucket. It is not just empty space waiting to be filled. It has structure, temperature, air pockets, fungal threads, decaying matter, channels left by roots, tiny spaces that either keep moisture where life can use it or let it vanish back into heat and air almost as quickly as it came. And if that system is damaged, exposed, compacted, overheated, or stripped of cover, then watering more can start to feel like filling a basket. You know this feeling even if you have never had words for it. Water a bed in the evening and by next day the top is pale again. Water a pot until it runs out the bottom and still the plant seems stressed. Break open the surface and beneath that first inch there is not the soft coolness you expected. Instead there is resistance, tightness, a kind of lifelessness that makes you want to reach for more water because water still feels like the only answer. But the truth is, dry soil is often not a simple lack of water problem. It is a broken system problem. And that should be a relief, because a lack of water problem can make you feel trapped. It tells you the answer is endless input. More time, more water, more dependence, more vigilance. It tells you the only way forward is to keep supplying from outside what the ground cannot hold for itself. But a broken system problem is different. A broken system can be rebuilt. A bad pattern can be reversed. A soil that gives water away too fast can be taught, slowly and physically, to behave like soil again. That is the deeper shift here, and it matters because it takes the shame out of the experience. If your soil dries out no matter how much you water, the lesson is not that you failed at the easy part. The lesson is that the visible dryness is only the surface expression of something deeper, something structural, something physical, something surprisingly old. And once you understand that, the whole scene changes. Now, when you look at a dry bed under full sun, you do not just see a place that needs more water. You start to see exposure, heat, open ground, unprotected surface, weak organic matter, compaction, fast loss. You begin to ask a different question. Not how much water can I pour in today, but why does this ground lose it so quickly in the first place? That question opens a very different door, because long before people relied on constant hoses, timers, and bagged fixes, growers understood something simple that modern gardening often forgets. Healthy ground was not meant to sit naked under heat and wind, taking direct impact from sun above and water from above while receiving no protection in between. Soil was meant to be covered, fed, opened, cooled, and connected to life. When it had those things, it behaved differently, not magically, physically, quietly, reliably. And once you start to see that, you stop treating dryness like a daily emergency and begin seeing it as a clue that the ground is telling you exactly how it has been left to function. Once you begin seeing dry soil as a clue instead of a verdict, a strange kind of relief starts to settle in, because most people who deal with this problem have been living inside the wrong accusation. They think the ground is dry because they did not do enough. They missed a day. They watered too lightly. They used the wrong tool. They were not attentive enough. So they respond with more effort, and the effort feels noble, but it is still aimed at the wrong target. It keeps them locked in the same exhausting loop. Notice dryness, react with water, watch the surface darken, lose that moisture again, repeat. That loop is built on an old belief, and it is a belief so common that it almost feels invisible. The belief is this: if soil is drying out, the answer is simply more water. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. But it hides a deeper mistake. It treats dryness as if it were only about supply, as if the main story were just how much water enters the system. In reality, the more important story is often what happens after water arrives. Does it sink in slowly? Does it meet organic matter, shade, root channels, and coolness? Does it enter a structure that can hold it in many tiny places? Or does it strike a hot, exposed surface, vanish upward, run sideways, or pass through ground that has lost the very qualities that make soil function like living earth? That is the belief that has to break before anything really changes. Because once it breaks, a new model can take its place, and the new model is both simpler and more powerful. Soil is not a tank you fill. It is closer to a living sponge under a roof of its own making. A good soil does not merely contain water. It slows water down, spreads it out, shelters it from direct heat, shares it with roots, and keeps enough air inside the system that life can keep transforming the ground from within. That is why two pieces of ground sitting only a few feet apart can behave like two different worlds. One is bare, hard, and exposed. The sun hits it directly. Wind brushes across it. Water lands on the surface and either seals the top flashes back into the air, or disappears through cracks and channels that do not really feed life. The other is covered with leaves, straw, plant residue, or some rough layer of organic matter. Beneath that cover, the surface is cooler. The air just above the soil is calmer. The water does not arrive in such a violent way, and when it gets through, it meets a looser, darker structure with more room for life to hold it. From above, both patches may have received the same amount of water, but below they are living in different physical realities. This is where people often realize they have been confusing wet with hydrated. A soil can look wet for a moment and still not be truly moisture stable. The top turns dark, but the system underneath is still exposed, compacted, hot, or biologically thin. It is like splashing water across a sun-baked road. For a moment, there is darkness. Then heat takes it back. The darkness was real, but it did not mean the road had changed. In the same way, a quick darkening of the surface does not tell you the ground has become capable of protecting moisture. And that matters, because viewers living with this problem are often doing exactly what modern life trains people to do with every other problem. They respond at the visible surface. The symptom appears and they answer it directly. Leaves droop, so add water. Soil pales, so add water. But in the natural world, surface symptoms often point downward. What you see on top is being decided by structure below and conditions around it. That is why this is not just a gardening tip, it is a different way of seeing. A lot of traditional growers understood this without speaking about it in technical language. They might not have said microclimate, evaporative loss, or aggregate stability. But they understood that land left bare behaves differently from land kept covered. They knew that the ground under plant litter, roots, fallen leaves, and partial shade held onto life in a way exposed soil could not. They knew that earth hardens when beaten by sun and water with nothing buffering either one. They knew that a healthy surface should not be naked and punished all day long. Modern gardening has a strange habit of making living ground look clean when it is actually becoming weak. A bare bed can look tidy, neat edges, open soil, nothing messy on top. You can see the surface clearly. But nature does not usually protect soil by exposing it. In forests, fields, old orchards, and undisturbed edges, the ground is almost always shielded by something. Leaves, needles, dying stems, low growth, mulch made by life itself. The earth is not sitting there uncovered unless something has disturbed it. That protection is not decorative. It is functional. It is part of how moisture remains in the world long enough to support roots and organisms. So when a person stands over a garden bed and wonders why it dries out so fast, the answer is often hidden in plain sight. The ground has been left to face the full force of the day alone. Sun strikes it directly. Air moves across it freely. Water lands on a surface that may already be sealed, hot or poor in structure. What disappears looks like a water problem, but underneath it is often an exposure problem. And that shift is important because it changes the emotional tone of the whole subject. Now the viewer is no longer the careless person who could not keep up. Now they are the person who inherited a bad model. They were told to respond to dryness with more input, when the wiser response was to ask why the system could not protect moisture on its own. They were taught to feed the symptom instead of rebuilding the conditions. That is not a small difference. It changes how the whole garden feels. Instead of living in a state of low-grade panic, checking the surface every day like a warning signal, they can begin to think more like a builder. What is overheating this soil? What is exposing it? What is missing from the top layer? What is missing from the structure below? Why does water leave so quickly here and linger there? Where is the cover, the softness, the porosity, the decaying organic matter that should be acting like a quiet reserve? Once those questions appear, the problem becomes more hopeful. Because water itself is expensive in many places, but protection is often not. Structure can be built slowly, organic matter can be added, surfaces can be shielded, heat can be interrupted, roots can be invited deeper. The ground can become less like a stage where water performs briefly and more like a body that knows how to retain what it receives. And this is where the old belief finally gives way. Your soil is not dry because you failed to water enough. Your soil is dry because the ground has not yet become the kind of place that knows what to do with water once it arrives. That is the new model. And once it takes hold, the question is no longer whether nature has a solution. The question is whether you are ready to notice how simple that solution has always been. The simplest way to understand this is to stop thinking about soil as dirt and start thinking about it as a physical structure made of spaces. Not empty space in the useless sense. Functional space, tiny chambers, narrow channels, soft pockets around bits of decaying plant matter, openings left by old roots, thin films of water held between particles, small shaded zones where heat moves more slowly and life can keep working. When soil is healthy, it is full of these little negotiations between air, water, organic matter, roots, fungi, microbes and temperature. That living architecture is what makes the difference between ground that stays gently moist and ground that swings wildly from wet to dry. This is why healthy soil can hold water without becoming a swamp. A lot of beginners imagine only two options. Either the soil drains or it holds water. Either it is dry or it is soggy. But the best ground does something more subtle than either of those extremes. It lets excess water move downward, yes, but it also keeps enough moisture spread through the smaller spaces that roots and organisms can continue using it long after the surface no longer looks dark. It breathes and holds at the same time. That balance is the real goal, not permanent wetness, protected moisture. And that balance is influenced by three very ordinary things people can actually observe for themselves: exposure, structure, and cover. Start with exposure. If you have ever walked barefoot across sunlit stone and then stepped onto ground under leaves or grass, your body already understands this principle. The exposed surface and the protected surface are not living in the same thermal reality. Bare soil in direct sun heats up quickly. Once the top layer heats up, water near that zone leaves faster. Air movement across the surface helps carry that moisture away. The hotter and more exposed the surface, the more the soil is asked to defend itself with no shield. It is not just about whether the day is warm. It is about whether the ground is taking the full blow of that warmth directly. Then there is structure. When soil is compacted, low in organic matter, or repeatedly left bare, it often loses the loose crumb-like condition that allows water to enter and stay distributed. Instead of soaking in gradually, water may hit the surface and either run off, slip through too fast, or create a shallow temporary wetness that does not really connect to a living network below. You can sometimes see this happen in a plain sight. The water lands, the surface darkens, and then, a few minutes later, it begins to lighten again, leaving little evidence that anything changed. It is not that the water never arrived, it is that the ground had too little structure to receive it well. Think of pouring water onto a dry sponge versus pouring it onto a sheet of hard cardboard. One invites the water in, the other resists, sheds or takes on moisture only in a thin, limited way. Soil can move along that same spectrum. When it is rich in decayed organic matter, root channels, and biological activity, it becomes more sponge-like. When it is stripped, compacted, and heated daily at the surface, it becomes more like something sealed. Then there is cover, which may be the most neglected piece of the whole puzzle. Nature almost never leaves good soil naked for long. That fact alone should tell us something. In a functioning system, the ground is usually protected by some kind of layer. Fallen leaves, dead stems, low plants, straw-like litter, chopped residue, wood fragments. Bark, even a canopy overhead that softens the force of sun and rain. That layer does several things at once. It blocks direct light from striking the soil surface. It reduces the speed at which wind can pull moisture away. It softens the impact of water so the surface is less likely to seal or crust. It gives organisms a cooler, safer place to live near the top. And over time, as that layer breaks down, it feeds the very structure that stores moisture better next season than it did this season. That is why a simple layer of rough organic matter can do more for moisture retention than many people expect. Not because it adds water, but because it changes the conditions under which water is lost. This is the point where the problem begins to feel less mysterious. The soil that dries fast is often too exposed, too hot at the surface, too low in organic buffering, too compacted, or too shallow in biological life. The answer, then, is not to keep forcing more water through the same broken pattern. The answer is to start rebuilding the pattern itself, and that is where the practical solution lives. It does not begin with some expensive product. It begins with giving the ground back the functions it is missing. If the surface is bare, cover it. If water is only hitting the top and vanishing, slow it down. If the soil feels tight and lifeless, feed the structure, not just the plant. If the ground is exposed to full force all day, create some interruption between the sun and the surface. If the soil has become a thin medium instead of a living layer, start adding the kinds of material that break down into softness, pore space, and biological activity. This can be surprisingly simple. A rough mulch layer. From leaves, straw, shredded stems, small wood chips, or partly broken down yard waste. Compost worked into the upper zone, where it can begin feeding life and improving texture. Watering more slowly and less often, so moisture sinks deeper instead of teaching roots to wait near the surface. Allowing roots to do part of the work by penetrating downward and leaving channels behind them. Even using shade strategically where appropriate, so the soil is not being baked open every day. None of these actions are glamorous. That is part of why people overlook them. They do not feel like emergency fixes. They feel almost too ordinary. But ordinary is often how natural systems work. Quiet layers, small protections, repeated biological processes, not dramatic rescue, but better conditions. And once those conditions begin to change, the ground changes with them. You start to notice that under the mulch, the soil stays darker longer. When you press your fingers beneath the surface, there is coolness where there used to be heat. Water no longer seems to disappear with the same speed. The crust softens. Worms show up. Fine roots linger near the surface without being scorched. The bed begins to hold a little longer after rain. Then longer still. This is what many people miss when they treat dryness only as an irrigation issue. They are trying to supply what the system keeps losing instead of asking how to make the system lose less. But nature's old answer to dryness was never endless pouring. It was better ground. Once you understand that the goal is not simply to add water, but to build ground that can keep it, the practical work becomes much clearer. And it also becomes much more patient. Because this is where many beginners make a second mistake. The first mistake is believing dryness always means a shortage of water. The second is thinking the fix must feel immediate. They want one change that solves the whole problem by next weekend. A bag poured in, a product mixed through. A watering schedule followed perfectly. But soil rarely changes in that kind of instant mechanical way. It changes like a body recovering strength. One condition supports another. Cover cools the surface. Cooler surface protects moisture. Protected moisture supports organisms. Organisms improve structure. Better structure holds water more evenly. Better water holding allows roots to go deeper. Deeper roots open more pathways, and slowly, what once felt like dead ground starts behaving differently. That slow change is not weakness, it is how durable change is made. The first practical principle is to stop attacking the surface. A lot of people water the way panic feels. Fast, frequent, reactive. They see pale soil and respond by wetting the top inch again. The problem is that shallow, frequent watering often trains both the gardener and the plant into the same fragile habit. The gardener keeps returning because the surface always looks dry. The roots keep waiting near the surface because that is where water repeatedly arrives. Then the next hot day comes, and both are in trouble again. A slower, deeper soak changes that relationship. Instead of flicking moisture across the top and leaving, you give the water time to enter. You allow it to move below the zone that heat steals first. You encourage the root system to follow that deeper moisture instead of hovering in the most vulnerable layer. This does not mean drowning the bed. It means watering in a way that favors depth over appearance. A surface can look less dramatic after a deep soak than after a quick spray, but the deeper soak is often doing more useful work. The second principle is to protect the top layer as if it matters, because it does. People often treat mulch like decoration or an optional finishing touch. In reality, it is closer to insulation for the soil. A simple layer of leaves, straw, shredded clippings that are not matted too thick, small wood chips, or other rough organic material can interrupt the whole cycle of heat and loss. It shades the surface. It reduces direct evaporation. It softens the strike of watering and rain. It gives the upper soil a chance to remain cooler and biologically active. It turns the first inch of ground from a battleground into a buffer zone. This is why one of the most revealing things you can do is pull mulch back with your hand in the middle of a warm day. On one side, bare soil sits pale and tight, almost glaring in the light. On the other, under that loose cover, the earth is darker, softer, and cooler to the touch. That simple contrast teaches more than almost any gardening advice ever will. It shows you that moisture is not just about what entered the soil. It is about what the soil was protected from after the water arrived. The third principle is to feed the structure, not just the crop. When people are frustrated, they often look for something that helps the plant directly. More fertilizer, more stimulant, more correction. But if the deeper problem is that the soil has poor moisture dynamics, then helping the plant without rebuilding the ground is like trying to help someone breathe better while tightening the room around them. Compost, partially decomposed organic matter, root residues, and biological life do something fertilizer alone cannot do. They improve the architecture of the soil itself. They create crumb structure, pore spaces, and a more sponge-like texture. They help water spread and linger in useful ways. That is why old growing systems so often relied on what the land itself was already producing: leaves, straw, manures, crop residues, spent plant matter, rough compost, cover crops. Not because people were romantic about tradition, but because they understood that ground becomes more stable when it is continually rebuilt from the top and opened from within. Now, this is also where one of the most common beginner mistakes needs to be named clearly. Many people try to fix dry soil while still leaving the surface bare. They improve the watering, they add compost once, they buy better soil, but then they leave the top open to direct sun, air, and impact. That is like filling a cool room and then removing the roof. The system never gets the chance to stabilize. If the ground is uncovered, the upper layer remains vulnerable, and the daily cycle of heating and drying continues almost unchanged. Another mistake is mulching badly. A good mulch layer is protective, but it still has to breathe. If people pile material too tightly against stems, keep the layer soggy and dense, or use fresh material in a way that mats into a sealed blanket, they can create other problems. The goal is not to smother the soil. The goal is to shield it while still allowing air, water movement, and biological exchange. Rough, airy coverage usually works better than a dense, suffocating layer. A third mistake is chasing softness with constant disturbance. Some gardeners notice compaction and respond by repeatedly turning, digging, or breaking the ground apart. There are times when intervention is needed, especially if the soil has been severely compacted. But endless disturbance can break fungal networks, expose moist zones, and speed oxidation of organic matter. In many cases, the better path is not constant disruption, but gradual rebuilding. Compost, roots, worms, mulch, moisture, and time. Let life do part of the loosening. This is where optimization becomes surprisingly simple. Observe where the heat hits longest. Notice which parts of the bed stay damp below the surface and which harden first. Watch how fast water enters. Does it soak in quietly or run sideways? Are the roots living shallow because that is where you always place moisture? Is the soil darker and softer where leaves collect naturally? Those small observations tell you where the system is already trying to teach you. Because the real optimization is not a gadget or a trick. It is alignment. Give the ground cover where it is exposed. Give it organic matter where it is thin. Give it slower soaking where it resists water. Give it time where you want biology to return. Give roots a reason to travel deeper. And with each of those changes, the same piece of soil begins to stop behaving like a surface that must be rescued every day and starts behaving like a place that can quietly support itself longer between interventions. That is the turning point. Not when the soil becomes perfect, but when it begins to hold on just a little better than before, and then a little better again. There is a moment when you realize the whole garden feels different. Not because everything is suddenly larger or greener in some dramatic before and after way. It is subtler than that. The difference is in the rhythm. You walk outside after a warm stretch and you no longer feel that low, familiar urgency to rescue everything. The beds are not begging. The pots are not cycling so quickly between stress and relief. You reach down, pull back the top layer with your fingers, and instead of powder and heat, you find coolness. Softness, a darker kind of stillness in the soil that tells you water has not merely passed through here. It has been kept. That future is usually what people wanted all along, even if they thought they were asking for something else. They thought they wanted the perfect watering routine, the right hose attachment, the right number of minutes, the right product to mix in. But deeper down, what they were really wanting was freedom from the constant need to intervene. They wanted ground that did not panic them, plants that did not collapse into daily emergencies, a garden that felt less like maintenance and more like relationship. And the reason that matters is because it reveals the true payoff of this whole shift. It is not only about moisture, it is about independence. When soil holds water longer, many other things begin to change with it. Roots can reach into a steadier environment instead of surviving from one surface watering to the next. Microbial life has a better chance to keep working. Worms and other soil builders remain active closer to the zone where plants need them most. The surface does not crust as easily. Young plants establish with less shock. Beds recover better after heat. Rain becomes more valuable because the ground is more prepared to receive it. Even your own behavior changes. You stop hovering so much. You stop reacting to every pale patch with the same old reflex. You begin to trust the ground a little more because the ground has become more trustworthy. That is the hidden self-reliance inside the whole subject. A lot of people hear self-reliance and imagine some large dramatic act of independence. Off-grid systems, huge harvests, total separation from outside support. But in real life, self-reliance often begins in smaller, quieter ways. It begins when a piece of land needs less constant rescue, when a bed no longer wastes the water you carry to it, when a simple layer of old leaves does more real work than another purchase, when the answer to a recurring problem turns out to be something you can build with time, observation, scraps, and patience rather than something you must keep buying. That is why this principle feels bigger than gardening once it really lands. You start to see how often modern life teaches people to respond only at the surface. If something dries out, add more. If something weakens, stimulate it. If something fails, intensify the input. But natural systems often ask a different question. They ask what condition made the loss so easy in the first place. They ask what was stripped away, what was overheated, what was left unprotected, what cycle was broken. They point not toward more force, but toward restored function. And that is what makes this such a quiet but powerful worldview shift. Because once you see soil this way, you do not just learn how to water better. You begin to understand that many struggles are not proof that you are failing. They are proof that the system around the thing has been made too fragile. The answer is not always greater effort. Sometimes it is better design, better protection, better alignment with how living systems already work when they are allowed to work well. You can feel that truth in the most ordinary garden scene. A bed under rough mulch after several warm days. The top layer still calm, the lower soil cool against your knuckles. A tomato or bean or pepper plant standing there without that strained, thirsty look it used to carry by noon. A watering can set aside for longer than before. Maybe not forever, maybe not perfectly, but longer. Long enough to remind you that progress in the garden often appears first as reduced desperation. That kind of progress matters. It matters because it changes what the garden teaches you every day. Instead of teaching you that life is always one missed input away from collapse, it starts teaching you that resilience can be built. That protection matters. That structure matters. That simple old practices survive for a reason. That the ground responds when you stop treating it like a dead medium and start treating it like a living system with physical needs of its own. And perhaps that is the deepest part of all this. Soil was never supposed to be bare, beaten, and expected to perform anyway. It was never supposed to sit open under heat and wind, take the full strike of the day, and somehow still behave like forest floor. When we ask it to do that, then blame ourselves for the failure, we miss the more generous truth. The ground is not being difficult, it is being honest. It is showing us the terms under which life can hold on and the terms under which it cannot. That honesty is useful. It tells you that a cracked, fast-drying surface is not just an annoyance, it is instruction. It is the land telling you that cover matters, softness matters, organic matter matters, slower water matters, shade matters, root depth matters. It is telling you that life below ground depends on what happens above it. And if you listen, the response does not need to be complicated. Protect the surface, feed the structure, slow the water, let roots go deeper. Build the kind of ground that can keep what it receives. Do that, and over time, the whole relationship changes. Not because you conquered the soil, but because you stopped fighting the wrong battle. You stopped asking how to pour more into a system that could not hold it, and started asking how to make the system worthy of what it was given. That is a different kind of gardening. Quieter, cheaper, older, less dependent. And once you see it, it becomes hard not to notice the same pattern everywhere else in life. So the next time you find yourself standing over pale, thirsty ground with a hose in your hand, pause for one more second before you answer dryness with more water alone. Look at the surface, feel the heat, notice what is missing. Ask what the ground has been exposed to and what it has been denied, because very often the soil is not asking you for more, it is asking you to see it differently. And when you do, the solution is no longer hidden. It is right there on the surface.